Good morning, everyone. It's Adrian here. I wanted to talk today about the subtle changes that the AQA GCSE examiners, GCSE English examiners are expecting in the English Language Paper 1, question 4. And so I'm going to share the screen and talk about it, how students must incorporate certain elements in order to get good grades. And there are subtle changes that have taken place. So these changes are going to be relevant for those that take place in 2024, in the summer of 2024. Now, the first thing that I would always suggest, and I've said this in my revision guide, Adrian's Revision Secrets 1 and 2, all along, that question 4 is a very important question. It's 20 marks. And, you know, we're talking about a 25-minute input into getting a good mark for this. But there are certain things that students still don't do. So I want to try to show what those are. In the question, it says, focus this part on the second part of the source. Now, you may say that this is obvious. It says it there, but just bear in mind that some students actually do the paper in order. They do question 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And if they are doing it in that order, they will have done question 3 before that. And question 3 is the structure question where the students have to look at the whole of the source. Now, you can imagine that after doing the whole of the source for an 8-mark question, it's highly likely they think they have to do the whole of the source for a 20-marker, which is the student says one. But no, it is quite clear that it's the second part of the source, and it's from line 34 to the end. So when we look at the source, 34 to the end, it's from there all the way through to there. So these kind of things are quite important. And even if they think they can reference something before line 34 related to the question, then they're wrong. You have to only use the evidence from the lines 34 to the end. So let's look at what this question is all about. And this one, the student says, was introduced way back in 2016 and has been continuing ever since. And it starts with a statement. In this case, we get a little bit more. There's a bit of context. It says, a student said, this part of the story where Alice is sent back along the road to find what has fallen from the roof and returns with the chrysanthemums shows, and then we go to the statement, shows how hard, so let's just get this one up here to make sure that we do it, shows how hard and cruel Hartop is. And then it says, so that all our sympathy is with Alice. Now, I've purposely looked at that statement and thought, well, you know, if you read the source from 34 to the end, and you then look at this statement, and you have to read it carefully. You mustn't rush your reading. I know there's a time frame, but that's why you must give 25 minutes. If you spend 5 minutes reading the source, you're going to know that source back to front. And this is what the examiners want. They want to show how insightful you are and how much you understand the source, and you can relate it to the period that it was written and what's going on with this family, etc., etc. So we look at the statement and it says, show how hard and cruel Hartop is. And then the second part of the statement is, so that all our sympathy is with Alice. And then you've got this question that is a bit of a loaded question. To what extent do you agree? Now that almost implies you're going to have to agree to an extent. How much do you agree is down to you. But what the examiners want now is they're accepting that if students answer this, they can answer that they agree, they disagree, they partly agree, or they just have a balanced view of both. But, and this is the warning, this statement has been put, and the words in the statement have been chosen specifically to make sure that you cannot really agree totally with the statement. All right. Now it says in your response, you could, and why AQA always put you could, giving you almost the impression that you can choose to do this or not to do this. That is not something that you want to say, I'll do it my way then. So the actual in your response, it should be a you should at the least, and you must, which is really what I would suggest. And now let's look at the bullet points. And bullet point 1 says, consider whether Alice is treated cruelly by her father. Notice that in this part of the advice given, it's getting students to focus on the word cruel. Now, it didn't say that in the statement. It says shows how hard and cruel Hartop is. So there's a little clue that maybe that advice is good advice again. But here's the one. This is the bit where we have to really make sure that we include the way we write our answers. It says evaluate how the writer creates sympathy for Alice. Now, if I took that question and you were doing an inspect course and I said, evaluate how the writer Priestley creates the character of Eric in an inspect course. Well, obviously, immediately when you think about that, you'd say, well, I'd have to look at the language that's used. I'll have to look at the way how Eric fits into the whole frame of the story, what his input is, and what structural elements are involved, etc., etc. But evaluate how means that we have to look at the methods the writer has used. Now, methods usually can be language and structure in a more prescriptive way, but my advice is we have to look at a broader view of the methods. And in this case, I would say, what is it that the writer is deliberately writing in the source to create the impact of our inferences about what we think is happening between Hartop and Alice in this particular extract. It does say at the bottom, support your responsive with references to the text. So if we look at, do we think Hartop is cruel? Let's try and find the evidence. So we go back and we look at the text. Hartop leaned across his wife and shouted, go back and see what it was. Now, all he's done there, he has leant across his wife, which is rude and disrespectful, but then he is a man and he probably thinks he can do what he wants. And then he shouted, but he's shouting because he's in the car. Alice has already got out and she's on the way looking to try and find the chrysanthemums. Hartop is speaking, doing all the talking, but there's no evidence in this first part here. There's no evidence at all that Hartop is being cruel, he's being a bit loud. And then there's a shift of focus from the writer going to Alice, and now we're looking from her perspective. And soon to Alice, it seemed to be moving very rapidly in the rain and the darkness. All she could see was the tail light smoothly receding. She watched it for a moment and they then began to walk back along the road. So she's out the car's moved away, and we get some of the idea of the conditions. The wind was behind her, but it seemed to veer and smash her with the rain full in the face. Now, we could feel sympathy for Alice at this point, that she's in this horrible condition. And that's quite descriptive of how it smacks her in the face. But she walked without hurrying. So if you were terrified of the rain, you'd probably be running along. She seemed to accept the journey as she accepted the rain and her father's words quite stoically. Now, she accepted the rain. She's used to it. And her father's word, and quite stoically. And if you look at the definition of stoic, it's somebody who has kind of resilience, just gets on with things, doesn't make a fuss. She walked in the middle of the road, looking directly ahead, as though she had a long journey before her. She could see nothing. And then after a time, she stumbled against something in the road. She stooped and picked up the bunch of pink chrysanthemums. And then she began to walk back again with them along the road. So there's nothing here that shows that she's having a tough time. She's just picking up flowers. Before very long, she could see the red tail light of the van again. It was stationary. She could see the lights of houses in the distance, I suppose, little squares of yellow with recurrent rain on her lashes transformed into stars. So the writer's now showing Alice in this kind of dreamlike way of dealing with horrible conditions and almost looking at a fairy tale kind of view. When she reached the van, Mrs. Hartop said, "What was it? What was it?" And Alice uses the fateful word, "only a bunch of chrysanthemums." And just as she says that, Hartop is nearby. And you see Hartop then repeating only 3 times. So the writer's deliberately focusing us on Hartop's reaction, where he goes, only, eh? Which is something that Alice had said, and he is having a go at her for saying only. And if you think about it, he's going to be a bit fed up and angry, because this is a poor family. They are living in the 30s, the Depression era, and they don't have a lot of money. So those chrysanthemums could represent food on the table. Alice stood mute, so that means she didn't say anything. Then Hartop raised his voice. No cruelty here. This is just somebody angry and raising his voice. And then he gives a command again. Well, don't stand there, do something. Go on, go on, go on. Go and see who wants a bunch of chrysanthemums. Move yourself. So by what the writer has included in here is the introduction of interaction through dialogue, which I suppose is a structural feature that you can mention, and saying this gives us a greater understanding of the relationship between Hartop and Alice, and I suppose to a lesser degree to the mother. And then we see the final line. Alice obeyed at once. So there's no confrontation. There's no bursting into tears because she's been so badly upset. She picked up the flowers, walked away, and vanished, all without a word. So when we go back to the question, we have started to see where the statement is, and how our reality of what we've read and what the statement is quite different to our point of view. So my feeling is we would still look at doing an introductory paragraph where we would probably like to say in the first part of the statement, that's we kind of accept that Hartop is quite belligerent. He's sort of badly behaved. He's a bit rude. But he certainly, there's no evidence to suggest he was cruel. He does shout a bit. And then the second part we look at, so that all our sympathy is Alice. Well, there's very little evidence to show that she needs sympathy. She seems quite a strong young lady. She seems to take it on the chin and carries on with what she's supposed to do. And by putting all this together, we would probably do an introductory paragraph to show to what extent do we agree. So we kind of are somewhere in between. We kind of agree with certain elements and disagree with other elements. And we would write then appropriate paragraphs relating our views by looking at the techniques that the writer has used. And this must be supported with references to the text. But it's quite, you can see that there is quite a lot of emphasis that the writer uses on behaviours. You've got contrasting behaviours between Hartop and Alice. Alice doesn't react, doesn't respond, and doesn't shout back. She could be tempted to because her father's quite mean. But Hartop is loud and gets his own way. So listen, I hope that helps. But these are the way we have to approach. My feeling is you would probably end up doing about 5 paragraphs, probably about 80 words per paragraph, 400 words, something like that. And you would spend 25 minutes on it. And you would pick out, each paragraph, you would give a bit of detail and insight. The rule of thumb these days is not just to pick loads of references and say this is this, but it's to go into those references and infer what this means much more. So you're kind of retelling the story from your own interpretation, and then you can finish it. I would probably focus on the elements of the bit about cruelly by her father. I'll probably do 3 different paragraphs focusing on a different sort of example for each of those, and then I would look at the sympathy for Alice as probably an extra paragraph, and talk about that in a bit more detail, and showing that actually, you know, the statement is quite balanced in this view. I hope that helped, and that will do. So any comments, please be free to get in touch, and don't forget that there's more information on my website.